The following program is made possible by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Race and immigration were centerpieces of the 2016 presidential campaign and the national dialogue. We talked to expert Tomas Jimenez about where we are and where we might be going. The game is immigration. The game is on. I'm Mark Simon. Welcome to the game. We are, it is said, a nation of immigrants. We also are a nation with a long history of animosity to newcomers as wave after wave of immigrants have landed on our shores and added to the complexity and challenges facing America. Nowhere was this more evident than the presidential campaign just ended. To talk about our history, where we are now, and where we might be going, we are joined by Tomás Jiménez, Stanford Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of the program Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. His newest book, due out in 2017, is The Other Side of Assimilation, How Immigrants Are Changing American Life. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
Give us, if you will, an overview, sort of the fuller picture. So much was said about immigration. Hordes wiping, attacking our shores, taking our jobs. Some of them apparently are supposed to be rapists. There was just this huge rhetorical wave about the immigration wave that this country is facing. Give us a sense of what's really going on. How many immigrants, how big is immigration? How many immigrants are here? How many illegals are here? That kind of a question.
Yeah, so there's some ironies about the rhetoric that came with the campaign in view of the kind of reality on the ground. So we are, in many ways, at historically high levels of immigration as a proportion of the total population. It's about 13% of the total population. About 1 in 4 people in the United States today are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. I said a minute ago that was at a historically high level. Having said that, we are at a level that is reminiscent of much of American history. In fact, the middle of the 20th century was an anomaly because we had so few immigrants living in the United States. So we are at a kind of normal level if you look at the grand scheme of American history. But kind of zooming in on the more contemporary period, the irony is that immigration, particularly from Mexico, has fallen below zero. That is to say, there are more Mexican immigrants leaving the United States in the last 2 years than there are coming into the United States. So the rhetoric about floods of people coming across the border, about Mexico not sending their best, which is a statement that the president-elect kicked off his campaign with, doesn't at all square with the truth. In fact, the truthful statement would have been Mexico's not sending anyone to the United States. There is more immigration now from Asia, that includes South Asia and East Asia, than there is from Latin America. However, there are large numbers of Latin American immigrants in the United States. Unlike the past, in the last 20 years, we've seen a settlement of immigrants, particularly from Latin America, not just in California and New York and Florida and Illinois, which are the kind of classic destination states. I should add Texas and Arizona perhaps to that, but in the Midwest and in the South. Mm-hmm. So while if the overall picture is one of large numbers of immigrants, a dramatic slowing of immigration since the Great Recession, especially from the largest source country, which is Mexico, and immigration being a truly national issue in ways that it wasn't in the past.
So it's an interesting phenomenon. In other words, there are more people who are recent immigrants in other parts of the country than the country is accustomed to.
That's right. So if you look at some counties in Kansas, Nebraska, Georgia, the Carolinas, and look at the growth of the immigrant population in these places in the last 20 years, in some cases we're talking about a 2,000% growth in the immigrant population. Now, part of that, the large percentage growth, has to do with the fact that there were so few immigrants there to begin with.
Right.
But, you look at
suddenly have this cluster.
Exactly. So, a county that I'm familiar with in southwestern Kansas, Garden City, Kansas, half of the population in Garden City, Kansas is Latino now. Which is quite extraordinary. There are counties in northern Georgia where more than a quarter of the population is now Latino, and that's due to immigration. And so it is really a national issue.
Yeah. How is it compared to sort of his? Well, I'll get to that question in a second. Let me ask about San Mateo County in particular, because I was part of an event where you spoke and you gave some data about San Mateo County that in some ways sort of illustrates what you're talking about.
Right.
Both in the big and the small, which is there may be more than people think, but there may not be as many as people think at the same time. It's one of those interesting sort of anomalies. Yeah,
well, I mean, San Mateo County, like a number of places in California, has a very large immigrant population. About a third of the population in San Mateo County was born in another country. If you add the number of people born, I should say, proportion of people born in another country to the proportion of people who have parents who are born in another country, you're somewhere at about half of the population.
No kidding.
And so, the immigrant experience is really part of a feature of San Mateo County, not just San Mateo County, I mean the entire Bay Area, and I would say indeed all of California in particular.
In this county, though, it seems like when people talk about immigration, they think about people from Latin America, and I guess to a lesser degree, Syria, people like that. But in San Mateo County, I would imagine a significant proportion of that is from Asia and Southeast Asia, and even the Indian subcontinent.
That's right. So in some ways, I would argue that the Bay Area is an exaggerated form of some of the patterns that we see in other places in the United States as a whole. So about half of the population of immigrants in San Mateo County come from Asia, and then roughly a quarter of the foreign-born population comes from Latin America, whereas nationally it's about half is from Latin America and a much smaller percentage from Asia. And so the perception you gave is right. The other way in which we have a kind of exaggerated form of national level trends in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, or the Bay Area as a whole is that the immigrant population is really bifurcated in terms of its education, educational background. So, it is often said that today's immigrants nationally are some of the wealthiest and most educated people in the United States and some of the poorest and least education, I'd say least formally educated population in the United States. And that's true in San Mateo County, although San Mateo County, the Bay Area as a whole, tends to have a much larger, highly educated population. We have a high-skilled population. The ratio of high to low-skilled, high-skilled being people with a college degree, low-skilled being people without a high school degree, is about 2 to 1 in the Bay Area. Which makes the Bay Area quite extraordinary.
Now, I mentioned in the open of the show, people think we're a nation of immigrants. I'm going to pose a question, and we're going to have to take a break.
Okay.
But we have a long history of wave after wave of immigration, many times greeted with a lot of hostility. No Irish need apply. Italians, almost every group that's come here from other shores has experienced this. And I want to ask you when we get back, is this different, or is this historically actually sort of the way America does things? And we'll get to that answer right after this break. Stay with us.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back to the game. I'm joined by Tomas Jimenez from Stanford University. I can run down through all your credentials again. We'll just call you an expert on immigration.
Okay.
How's that sound?
Fair enough.
I was posing the question, we've had wave after wave. Is this significantly different, or does it fit into the larger American context of wave after wave, greeted often with hostility when they first come here?
The short answer is yes and no. It's similar in a number of ways. It's similar in the size relative to the overall population. You know, I mentioned a minute ago, it's roughly 13% of the population. About a quarter of the population was born in another country, or has parents who were born in another country. So it's similar in its size. In some ways, it's similar to in the reaction. You have, and you see it kind of in full bloom, the negative reaction in the presidential campaign, and the way in which that negative reaction can kind of harness a sense of nationhood, a particular kind of sense of nationhood. But I would argue also that today, probably more so in the past, but also in the past, there were competing notions of nationhood. There were notions of an American identity that was inclusive of immigrants. So
the melting pot.
The melting pot of a particular sort, right? Or the settlement house. It's a notion that immigrants were people who needed to be integrated. If you look at some of the early intellectuals in the early part of the 20th century, particularly coming out of the University of Chicago writing about immigration, they talked about the kind of American culture and the contributions of immigrants to it in ways that would be reminiscent of a kind of multicultural notion of things. And we certainly have that today. We have a much more expansive notion of what it means to be American. And that more expansive notion competes with more narrow notions of what it means to be American that I think you saw fomented in the election. So in some ways there are similarities, but there are really important differences. Probably the most obvious difference is that the overwhelming majority of immigrants today, in the last 4 decades or so, come from Latin America, from Asia, also the Caribbean, so non-European origins. If you look at the previous waves of immigrants...
One might say non-white.
Non-white, right, that's right. And it's a larger conversation, but notions of what it means to be white have also changed legally and also socially over time. But if you look at previous waves of immigrants, they came overwhelmingly from European origins. Even the folks who came in the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century from European origins, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, there were ways in which they were all legally white, which at that point in time was very significant for citizenship laws, for where you could buy a home, for whether you could join a trade union. But their social whiteness was in question. That is the sense in which they were regarded as racially different from Northern Europeans was very real. And so the difference has to do with European origins overwhelmingly in the past, non-European origins today. Another incredibly important difference are notions of legality. All of the immigrants, virtually all of the immigrants who came in previous waves came legally. Now, they came legally because it was almost impossible to come illegally. There was no way to come illegally, with a few exceptions. One exception was for a period of time after the 1880s, if you were Chinese. The Chinese have the dubious distinction of being the only group that has an Immigration Exclusion Act named after them. So Chinese were not allowed to immigrate. And then there was a period of time where you couldn't immigrate at all from Asia because Asians were ineligible for citizenship. But it's really important to be clear that when people say, my grandparents, my great-grandparents came the right way, there was only one way to come. It really wasn't until 1924, when there was a massive overhaul of our immigration laws, that the notion of illegality came into existence. And we've been wrestling with it ever since. And we've been wrestling with it ever since. So there's a status.
So that's the other part of the image of the last campaign is this hordes of non-legal, undocumented.
Right.
And how accurate is that?
Well, so the best estimates are that we have somewhere in the range of 11 million what we call unauthorized, undocumented, illegal immigrants in the United States. They make up less than 3 in 10 immigrants in the United States today. It's a huge number of people. Many of those people, roughly 40 to 50%, came legally and overstayed a visa. The remaining entered without inspection. It's important to note that, particularly since the Great Recession, that number has declined by about 1 million. And what we have today is an unauthorized population that comes overwhelmingly from Latin America, to be sure, but that is well settled. These are not people who are just arriving. The median length of stay for an unauthorized immigrant is somewhere in the range of 13 to 14 years. Many of them own homes. Many of them have children who were born in the United States who are U.S. citizens. So, you know,
so this notion of rounding them up and sending them back really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense in a lot of ways. I mean, let's just say that that's what we wanted to do. The logistics and cost of that would be staggering. This is to say nothing of the social cost. The cost to the families who get torn apart. And we've had, under the Obama administration, close to 400,000 people have been deported annually, which is a record. So here's the other thing. When people say that the Obama administration has not been tough on immigration, by that count, the Obama administration has been tougher on immigration than any administration in American history, just by the number of people who've been deported. But there's also a social cost to the communities they live in. You know, San Mateo County, for example, 8% of the population, not 8% of the immigrant population, 8% of the total population is unauthorized, roughly similar in Santa Clara County, where I live. You know, these are people who are living and working, sending their children to school. They're people who are, in many cases, our neighbors, our friends. So when we talk about the social cost, there is a spillover effect into the communities that they live in. And those communities aren't exclusively immigrant communities all the time. You know, the figure of 13 to 14 years being the median length of stay for unauthorized immigrants begins to hint at the degree to which that population, not to mention the overall immigrant population, is enmeshed in life in the United States in ways that are hard to measure.
We're going to get into that topic some more. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
It's been over 150 years since Wells Fargo first opened for business. Since then, we've enjoyed your community support, and we're passionate about returning it. Every day, Wells Fargo team members roll up their sleeves and donate their time to organizations and charitable groups throughout the Bay Area. Nationally, we've committed even more. In just the past 2 years alone, we've donated over $70 million to support schools and educational programs. It's a commitment we're proud of. Wells Fargo, the next stage.
Welcome back. We're joined by Tomas Jimenez from Stanford University, and we're talking about his field of expertise, immigration. When you were just talking about sort of getting to the topic of assimilation, fitting in. And that's one of the things that we always prided ourselves on, is that ultimately everybody fits in. They make a contribution to our culture. We all have a favorite taco stand. It's not an accident. It's because of the people who make taco or pizza or spaghetti, whatever ethnic food you want to talk about.
Right.
There's the notion during the campaign that people are sick and tired of America being diluted or diverted or undermined by this. But that's not what you think the reality is, apparently.
Well, you know, I think that when you have a big national event like an election, it is an opportunity to step back and take stock of who we are.
That's a generous view, isn't it?
Right. Well, no, I mean, it is not just an exercise in democracy. It is an exercise in kind of thinking about what does it mean to be American, and the candidates offer differing views about what it means to be American. And President-elect Trump offered a notion of American identity that we don't typically see from national politics, at least in the last few decades. But I think it would be very easy to extrapolate from the results of the election that the United States is anti-immigrant, that the United States is uneasy with immigrants. And I think that's part of the story, but it's part of a larger story of American ambivalence about immigration. There are things that we love about immigration as a country. You mentioned some of the cultural contributions of immigration, particularly as it relates to food. And I know few people who would argue that the greater accessibility of different kinds of cuisine is a bad thing about immigration.
Right.
But if you look at national polling, that ambivalence it really kind of emerges. So I think people would be surprised to know that the proportion of Americans who believe that people in the United States who are unauthorized should be put on a pathway to legal residency has actually increased since the presidential election. It's about 60% of Americans believe that. It's hard to get 60% of Americans to agree about anything, and there's been a consistently large majority of Americans who believe that unauthorized immigrants ought to be put on a pathway to citizenship. If you look at national polling about American national identity, roughly 3/4 of Americans believe that being a true American entails blending in. Mm-hmm. And 3/4 of Americans also believe that being a true American entails hanging on to some sense of your ethnic heritage. I don't think that highlights maybe some ambivalence, but highlights also a vision of American identity, a notion of American identity that is, harkens back in some ways to the melting pot of multiple contributions.
And it's counter to what President-elect Trump said during the campaign. Has he done damage to the whole notion of immigration and how Americans feel about people who come here? There's a portion of us that is sort of proud that we're the place people want to come to. Has he done damage to that? Has he done damage to our reputation elsewhere?
I think it's hard to know whether he's done damage. I think that I don't think it's saying much to say that it certainly hasn't helped our reputation, and it hasn't helped the conversation. I think that we follow our leaders, and this has been true historically. So I talked a minute ago about different competing notions of American identity. Those competing notions have been articulated by our leaders. And there's actually really good political science research that shows that people kind of don't care a ton about immigration. It's not on the top of mind in day-to-day life, but when it's activated by a major news story or activated by politicians, then they can get whooped up about it. If you look at the last 4 presidential elections prior to 2016, people didn't talk about immigration at all. And in fact, the candidates of both parties generally agreed on immigration. So what he has done, that is President-elect Trump, is fomented something that might otherwise be dormant or even kind of a lukewarm sentiment. So in that sense, absolutely, I think the people are afraid. Particularly people who are unauthorized, people who are recipients of President Obama's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program. So people are afraid, and that fear is permeating not just those immigrant families, but places like San Mateo County, places like California, New York, where that immigrant experience is so much a part of the region's identity. The fear is already there. So yes, I think he has potentially damaged the national conversation, and it remains to be seen exactly what he does, and nobody knows. Anybody who pretends to know is fooling you. But
well, if we can talk for a second about sort of the nuts and bolts of it, one of the primary features of his talk about immigration was building a wall. You said at the beginning of the show that it's actually net zero, that people are actually going the other way. So I guess he puts the wall up and then they can't go back. But is there any practical application that makes any, people clearly embraced the idea that we needed to do something to stop porous borders and a negative impact that we're having. Is there something that should be done? Is there something that could be done? Or is just this, are people always going to come here no matter how difficult we make it for them?
Well, let me just go back to something you said a second ago, which is building a wall might make it tougher for people to go back. That's exactly what our immigration policies of the last 2 decades have done. We have increased border fortification, particularly in urban areas. which made it harder for, and I'm talking about a period when especially unauthorized immigration was really growing rapidly, so in the 90s and then into the 2000s. So we made it harder for people to cross in urban areas. They started going to more remote areas like the desert, where the natural elements are really harsh and people under threat of dying, and people are dying by the thousands. And because it was so dangerous, they started paying smugglers to help them get across, so it got expensive and dangerous. So if you paid $4,000 and risked life and limb to cross in the Sonora Desert to get to the United States, you're not going to keep going back and forth. You're not going to go back for your niece's quinceañera. You're not going to go back when grandma dies. You stay. And so actually our border policy has done exactly what you've said. We have kept people in.
Why do people go back? I mean, we've only got a minute left, so this is the last question.
People go back because the economy had a lot to do with it. There were just fewer opportunities. And in a few places, the rhetoric was becoming so poisonous that I think people were feeling it just wasn't worth it economically or socially to stay.
Tomas Jimenez, Stanford professor, specialist in immigration. Feel like we barely scratched the surface. When your book is out, let's come back and we can talk about this again. Meanwhile, you join us again next time, and thanks for being with us this time on The Game.